Welcome back to Hand Tool Rescue. Today I'm focusing on this label paster called the Stick Fast Label Paster, made by the A.V. Ross Company, of which there is almost no information whatsoever on the internet about this specific company. There's very few mentions of it. There's actually very few examples of this actual paster itself online. I could only find two other photos, and that was it. There's not a lot of mention in catalogs or anything like that. It was very limited. I was lucky in that I could find the patent, so that helped kind of dissect which parts were missing, if they were missing, or which parts do what and what they're made of. So, just kind of the first initial diagnostic here. You see the chip missing out of the corner of the base, and the top looks to be kind of painted oddly. You can see right at the edge of the casting, it just looks like it was randomly painted. So I'm not exactly sure what the original color was supposed to be. But I really liked this one. It caught my eye just kind of due to the mixed materials. This one, the top seems to be copper plated. The bottom's cast iron. The gears are all brass. It's very mixed media, I guess you would say. It's very odd. I'm not really sure why they copper plated the top casting and not the bottom. I don't know if it was glue resistant coating or something like that. I'm really not sure. I would love to know why. If anybody knows, please let me know. As usual, I'm trying to preserve, using the most proper tools at all times, preserve the original brass label as much as humanly possible. You could totally remake this with just some acid etching and a printer and a little thin sheet of brass. But I don't want to, in the sense that I got to preserve some history here. I got to restore what's there and not kind of remake things as much as I can. The labels itself, I have a specific weird thing about them. I love keeping them. So usually I keep them around. I'll just repaint it. This little brass clip thing, there's two on either side. I guess that's all that held this entire thing together. But I will remake those because they're kind of worn and a little flimsy. So each metal disc, or I guess brass disc, has these kind of grooves cut into them, almost like teeth, but not really fully pointed at the end. They're much more flat. It's almost like they just kind of cut grooves into the end, or like lightly knurled, let's say, would be a better description of what's going on. So some of those were worn for some reason, so those will need addressing, as well as you could see I had to file away a little bit. So there is some wear or some bulging from peening or wear or something that would stop these from coming off easily. But they're in there and they index themselves, and it seems to be in a specific order, so I'll try to remember that as the best I can when I go to put this back together. So just due to its age, which is probably the 20s, due to the patent being filed in the 20s, that's probably lead paint or Japanning. I can tell immediately as soon as I put some paint stripper on if it is paint or Japanning. And this one seemed to be Japanning, which ends up being really tough to take off. It doesn't react to paint stripper like normal. I'm going to do something a little different and throw the brass parts in the vibratory tumbler that I used to deburr all the wrenches. I've been wanting to do this for a while, and I just never got around to it. A stone finish would probably look really nice on these brass parts, just because they don't really need to be shiny, but they do need to be clean and a consistent look, which is what I prefer. On the label, once again, I will go with really, really, really fine steel wool and just take my time and kind of remove what I could, making note of the original colors that were there before I started removing them. And I noticed red inside the letters, And that's what I'm going to try to recreate here. I just very aggressively paint over it, and then I can remove it with sandpaper, and that should, get me the result I'm looking for. This thing isn't flat, so it's a little more of a pain to kind of get all the paint off in the areas I need it to, but it just makes it more fun. I've chosen specifically to actually repaint this by hand because it was probably done that way, and I want to try and at least practice at some really finer painting. So in the areas that I can't reach with the marker, I'm just going very roughly with the fine brush to get in all of those specific areas. And then once I got the black coat over all of the red, I can go with this really, really tiny chisel that I have and just remove the high points. I would try to use sandpaper, but it would probably get onto areas that are higher or lower than the letters. And I don't really want that. I want to kind of get just the raised letter areas. So I got to be exact with the little chisel. And that just took, probably a few hours to kind of get it perfect, back and forth between painting and removing. But I think it turns out great. So I'm just hitting this with steel wool once again to kind of brighten up the copper plating. I don't want to sand through it. I don't want to remove it all and replate it. I think that's completely unnecessary. There's actually a very nice amount of it left, so I'm just going to leave it. I am going to rebush, I guess add bushings. They never had bushings. These were elongated holes for some reason. I couldn't really figure out how they were elongated because there's just brass that ran in this, and brass wouldn't really eat through the cast iron. So I don't really know what was going on. Maybe someone intentionally filed them larger for some reason because the photos online don't show any kind of elongated hole. It's very odd. So this is where I took 9,000 hours of my time, kind of cutting grooves back into the worn sections. You can kind of see as I work my way up, it's more and more worn, so it just will take a little longer. They just need a little bit of love there to help grab the actual glue instead of just nothing happening. So after the stone washing in the tumbler, all the rust was off of the cast iron pieces as well, the gears. And the kind of soapiness that's in the tumbler gets in between the threads there, and it helps me take it off more easily. Because before I didn't want to, this is cast iron threaded on brass. It's very easy to destroy that brass. So just taking my time, using a lot of padding, both hot glue and fabric-wise, and they actually came off quite easily. So I'm happy about that, and I can go and clean up the threads, both inside and outside threads of this little assembly here. You have to do the wire wheeling. It is the only thing that kind of gets in between those teeth of those gears. Plus, I haven't really shown a lot of wire wheeling lately. Next up is TIG welding that broken missing corner piece. So I'm just going to build up this section as much as I can. We're using an Inconel rod, so that should stick to pretty much anything. You never know what type of cast iron is going on here, so let's just play it safe with that type of rod. And with the standard preheat of the cast iron, stops any kind of cracks from forming anywhere else. And it turned out great. We didn't have any massive cracks show up anywhere else on the casting, which was always my fear, but it was fine. In terms of cleanup, the belt grinder makes very quick work of that, and it gets me close enough to where I need to be in terms of the finish that I'm looking for. But with the remaining Japanning, I ended up just removing with the sandblaster because I know it's Japanning. I don't have to worry about lead paint or anything like that. And then once clean, I can fill up the large voids in the casting that the really thick Japanning previously filled. And that's what's kind of nice about Japanning, is it's so thick, like it will fill large voids in castings and make things look very smooth. So it's just nice to kind of replicate that with some Bondo, I guess.
Keep it down!
All right. After the musical interlude, you can see me applying some filler primers to some nicely sanded Bondo. I haven't used Bondo in a long time on any of these pieces, but in this case I thought it was appropriate. I'm going to paint this in a flat black and then clear coat it with a glossy finish, and this to me looks a little bit more like the original Japanning. It has more of that depth that it seems to have, and that's kind of depth in quotations. It's just something that seems to look a little better for the original product. This is a new to me power hacksaw. It's fairly large, but it doesn't have kind of a feed adjustment. I just have to kind of hold it right now. I need to restore that and get to it. But the main reason I cut the brass off is so I can remake these little tab things that held the whole thing together, since they were kind of worn and warped and floppy. So you might as well make something new every once in a while. And this is probably something that, wasn't meant to be taken off and on 400 times. So it's about time it got some new pieces in there. The belt sander or belt grinder is just the greatest tool. Look at this, it just eats brass for breakfast. Look at it. It's not fair. And then I just very roughly filed these back to what they needed to be in order to secure both ends of the metal disc roller assembly. It didn't need to be anything exquisite. It needed to just work. This is basically like a screw or bolt in terms of it's just a fastener. So no need to go crazy on this. You can see I use a highly technical application method where I just tap it in exquisitely, and then I start assembling. So this is the only disc that's different. It has a kind of raised tab to capture the washer nut thing, and then I'm trying to assemble this back how it was supposed to be, and it seems to go fine for the most part. It just, once you kind of get them all together, you need to kind of respace them and make sure they index back into themselves. They should be alternating between larger spaces and smaller spaces. And you'll kind of see what I mean when I go to actually fully and completely assemble it. It just helps it not run into the rollers on the top that are needed to cross over the kind of cylindrical area of the discs in order to keep the paper or whatever you're gluing down to the gluing discs, if that makes sense. You'll see it perform very soon. So that fit in nicely into the new bushings, no wobble at all, obviously. It fits fantastically. Almost too fantastically. That's the concern I'm dealing with at this point. You could see how the top rollers and the bottom rollers shouldn't be touching, and that's why there's a specific way it is supposed to go back together. And once you screw the brass handle on, it's time to give it a spin, and it seems to be fine. Nothing's massively loose. Nothing is binding anywhere, so it seems to be completely fine. These are the actual original nails that held the brass label on, and I'm going to reuse them. They're actually in totally fine condition, and they're obviously the perfect size already. So once you clean them up with like a little bit of high grit, like 1000 grit sandpaper, they'll be just fine and match match the original, because they are original. These are in a lot of things, and I really do hate them. If you can't get access to them from behind, it's just a disaster. But that's just one of the easiest ways to fasten these kind of labels onto a solid casting. So I'm just going to, even though the bushing is already an oiled bronze bushing, it's not going to hurt to add a little bit of oil there. Even on the gears, even though this isn't, a high speed, high wear scenario, it just makes it a little bit more quiet to use if you add some oil. And I'm just using 30 weight non-detergent, which is the standard that I use for most of these older tools. So the first test, I just used some wood glue and some labels that I had made with my logo on it that I was going to use when I packaged some goods out to send to people, but I never actually got around to it because I wanted to restore this first. But here you can see the label, and then it actually works amazingly well. It makes nice lines of glue, consistent, and would be totally adequate to like slap on a bottle or a box or whatever you happen to be labeling in 1927. So that's great, except I wanted to use this with those labels that you saw, and they are water activated. So they need just like almost like a envelope that you lick. You just have to add some moisture, and that will activate the glue that's already on the back. So this roller, this pure cylindrical roller, is the kind of attachment that would make that possible, maximizing surface area that the water can adhere to, so that I'm maximizing the amount of water that touches the glue. Now, I didn't really come up with this idea. That in the patent, there's actually a reference to a cylinder like this and attachments where those holes are on the main top casting, and those would work together to do something similar to this. So it wasn't my idea, but maybe I can find a model that has the original metal cylinder. I don't know. Anyways, thank you once again for joining me on this exquisite restoration adventure, and I will see you in the next one. Later.